He thought the badge on his chest gave him the right to decide who belonged on his roads and who didn't. Officer Dan Porter was the kind of cop who treated every shift like a personal audition for the role of God. He had been patrolling the back roads of Millhaven for 16 years, long enough to believe the town was his, and short enough to never have faced real consequences. To Dan, authority wasn't a responsibility. It was a costume he never took off. But on a warm Tuesday night, somewhere between his third cup of coffee and his fourth act of arrogance, Dan Porter made the biggest mistake of his life. He didn't just pull over a woman driving alone after dark. He pulled over the wrong woman entirely. The night air in Millhaven sat heavy. That thick southern kind of dark where the crickets are loud and the streetlights barely try. Dan was parked in the usual spot behind the old grain mill on Route 9. The one place where the speed limit drops without warning and the sign is half hidden by an oak tree that hasn't been trimmed since 2004. He liked it there. It was convenient. Productive, he called it. He was working on a gas station sandwich when the headlights rolled past. A black Mercedes. Clean. Late model. Moving slow and steady, like somebody who knew the roads. Dan's jaw stopped mid-chew. In his mind, there was a calculation he ran automatically, the same one he'd been running for 16 years. He looked at the car. He looked at the driver. And before that driver had done a single thing wrong, Dan Porter had already decided she was suspicious. He pulled out. No siren, just lights. The Mercedes signaled, slowed, and pulled over without hesitation. Smooth, calm, no drama. The driver had done this before. Not because she was guilty of anything, but because she was a black woman in America and she knew exactly what the lights behind her meant. Her name was Carrie Russell, 38 years old, natural hair pinned back, navy blazer, still on from a long day that wasn't supposed to end like this. She rolled down the window. She kept her hands visible. She waited. Dan walked up slow, flashlight first, already running a script in his head, the kind of script built out of assumptions stacked so high they had their own zip code. License and registration, he said. No greeting. No reason. Just a command dressed up as a request. Carrie looked at him, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet, practiced patience that Dan immediately read as attitude. He had no idea what was clipped to the badge holder tucked in her center console. He had no idea who she worked for. He had no idea that the next 5 minutes were going to end everything he thought he'd built. This isn't just a story about a bad traffic stop. It's a story about what happens when a man with a small badge decides to pick a fight with a woman carrying a much bigger one. Buckle up. To understand what happened on Route 9 that Tuesday night, you have to understand Dan Porter. Not the version of Dan he showed at church on the rare Sundays he attended. Not the version he performed at the precinct Christmas party. The one who laughed too loud and slapped backs too hard. You need to understand the real one. The one who climbed into that cruiser every shift like he was suiting up for war against a town that had never actually threatened him. Dan Porter was 44 years old, thick through the neck and shoulders in the way that men get when they used to be athletic and stop trying somewhere around 30. His hair was dark brown, going gray at the temples, cut close, parted with the kind of military precision that made it look like his appearance was the one thing he still controlled. His face was wide, weathered, a permanent squint built from years of sitting in sun-soaked patrol cars pretending to watch traffic while actually watching people. He wasn't ugly. He wasn't remarkable. He was just the kind of man you'd forget, unless he had power over you. Then you remembered every detail. Dan had grown up in Millhaven. Born there, schooled there, failed at leaving twice. The first time was a football scholarship to a mid-level state school that evaporated after a knee injury in the second semester. The second time was a girl, a woman, really, who took him as far as Charlotte before the relationship collapsed under the weight of who he actually was without the uniform. He came back to Millhaven at 26 with nothing but a grudge and an application to the police department. He passed the exam on the second try. That was 16 years ago. And in 16 years, Dan Porter had cultivated something dangerous in a small town, a reputation without accountability. The other officers called him Dagger. Not because he was sharp, but because he had a way of slipping into situations and making things worse. The name started as a joke. Dan adopted it like a trophy. He had on a keychain. He told the story at every precinct gathering like it was a medal of honor, not a warning label. Dan had a method. That was the thing about him. He wasn't random. He was deliberate. He knew which roads had the most out-of-town traffic. He knew which hours meant fewer supervisors on duty. He knew the exact positioning of every camera on his patrol route, which ones worked, which ones were angled wrong, and which ones had been reported broken for months and quietly left that way. He had been working this beat long enough that the infrastructure of Millhaven had shaped itself around his habits, or maybe the other way around. His stops were calculated. His targets were consistent. Black drivers, out-of-state plates, anyone in a car that looked like it cost more than what he assumed they should be able to afford. He told himself it was instinct, that his gut had been honed by 16 years on the job, that he could smell trouble before it announced itself. But instinct was just another word for bias when the pattern never changed, and Dan's pattern had never once changed. In the last 2 years alone, Internal Affairs had received 7 complaints about Dan Porter. Excessive force, unlawful search, racially motivated stops. Each one was reviewed. Each one was closed. Millhaven was a small town, and the review board was made up of men who had known Dan since he was kicking a football across a high school field. Accountability requires distance. In Millhaven, there was none. So Dan Porter kept driving, kept stopping, kept operating in the absolute certainty that nothing he did would ever catch up with him. He had one particular weakness that the people closest to him knew and said nothing about. Dan hated being looked at like he didn't matter. It was a deep, almost feral sensitivity. He could handle confrontation. He could handle anger. What he couldn't handle was indifference, being dismissed, being looked through instead of looked at. The women were the worst in his mind. The ones who didn't flinch. The ones who asked calm questions in full sentences and looked at him like he was a mild inconvenience rather than an authority to be feared. Those stops always went longer than they needed to. Those stops always had a way of escalating. He didn't know it about himself. Or maybe he did and called it something else. Called it maintaining respect. Called it command presence. Called it doing the job. But what it really was, stripped clean of the language he used to dress it up, was this. Dan Porter needed people to be afraid of him. Because somewhere underneath the badge and the belt and the 16-year performance of power, he was terrified that without it, he was nothing at all. That Tuesday night, when the black Mercedes rolled past his hiding spot on Route 9, Dan wasn't thinking about the law. He wasn't thinking about probable cause or reasonable suspicion or any of the legal framework that was supposed to anchor every decision he made while wearing that uniform. He was thinking about the car. He was thinking about the driver. And he was thinking the same thought he always had, the one worn deep into his brain like a groove in old wood that doesn't belong here. He never once considered that he might be wrong. He had never had a reason to. Tonight, that changed. Carrie Russell had left the federal building in downtown Raleigh at 8:47 p.m. She knew the exact time because she had looked at her watch on the way out, a habit, the kind built from years of work where time was logged, documented, and accounted for. She had a 2-hour drive back to Millhaven. She had a case briefing on her laptop that still needed final edits. She had a son at home who was probably already asleep, being watched by her mother, who would want to talk when Carrie got in regardless of the hour. It had been a long day, sitting on top of a long week, sitting on top of a long year. All she wanted was to get home. She merged onto Route 9 at 9:12 p.m., dropped her speed to match the limit, and turned the music down low. Gospel. Something slow and steady. The kind of music that didn't demand anything from you. It just held you. The road was empty. Dark in the way that rural roads get dark. No streetlights. Just the reach of headlights and the occasional reflector post blinking amber on the shoulder. She knew this stretch. She had driven it 100 times. She knew where the speed limit dropped. She knew where the road curved. She signaled for every lane change, even when there was no one else on the road. That was Carrie. Even alone, she drove like she was being watched. Because she knew from experience that sometimes she was. She almost didn't notice the cruiser. It was parked deep in the shadow of the old grain mill, lights off, engine idling. The kind of positioning that wasn't about safety or traffic enforcement. It was the positioning of someone lying in wait. She clocked it in her peripheral vision, a dark shape that didn't belong against the mill wall, and her stomach did the small, quiet drop that it always did. The involuntary response. The one that years of professionalism and composure hadn't been able to fully train out of her, because it wasn't about weakness. It was about memory. Her own memory and her mother's before that. She kept her speed exactly where it was. Hands at 10 and 2. Music still low. She passed the grain mill at 9:19 p.m. Inside the cruiser, Dan Porter set down the gas station sandwich. He leaned forward over the steering wheel, squinting through the windshield at the black Mercedes moving steadily up Route 9. His flashlight was on the passenger seat. His coffee was in the cup holder, gone cold 20 minutes ago. The radio was murmuring low, dispatch chatter from across the county. Nothing urgent, nothing that required him. He had time. He watched the Mercedes the way a man watches something he has already decided about. Not searching for information, but looking for confirmation of what he had already concluded. The car was clean. Too clean for Route 9 on a Tuesday night, in his estimation. Late model. Dark paint that caught the moonlight like it had just come off a showroom floor. Who drives a car like that out here? The question wasn't really a question. It was the opening line of a story he had already written. He leaned further forward. The headlights of a passing truck briefly illuminated the interior of the Mercedes, and Dan caught a flash of the driver. A black woman. Alone. Hair pinned back. Eyes on the road. The sandwich wrapper crinkled in his fist. He didn't check her plates. He didn't wait for a traffic violation. He didn't observe any behavior that a reasonable officer could point to and call suspicious. She was doing the speed limit. She was in her lane. She had done nothing, except exist on a road that Dan Porter had decided was his. But Dan Porter had never needed a reason. He had only ever needed an excuse. And he already had one forming. He threw the cruiser in a drive. The gravel under his tires crunched and popped as he rolled out from behind the mill and eased onto the pavement. He didn't hit the siren. He flipped on the lights. The slow, silent strobe of blue and red that filled the dark road like a warning, and accelerated until he was close. Too close. The kind of distance that was designed to intimidate, not to enforce. He keyed his radio. Asterisk dispatch. This is Unit 7. I'm initiating a stop on Route 9 northbound. Black Mercedes, heading toward the county line. Possible. Asterisk, he paused, choosing his word. Asterisk, suspicious behavior. Asterisk, the dispatcher on duty, a tired man named Carl who had been on since 6 that morning, came back flat. Asterisk, copy, Unit 7. Probable cause. Asterisk, Dan didn't answer the question. He just repeated his unit number and released the button. In 16 years, no one had pushed him past the first response. Carl didn't either. Carrie saw the lights before she heard anything. The blue and red filled her rearview mirror and she felt it again. That drop, that quiet sinking. And this time it didn't pass. It settled. She took one slow breath. Then another. She signaled right, even though there was nowhere specific to go, because the signal was a message. Asterisk, I am complying. I am calm. I'm not a threat. Asterisk. She pulled onto the gravel shoulder near the fence line of an empty field and put the car in park. She turned the music off completely. She placed both hands on top of the steering wheel where they could be seen without question. She had run this drill before. In her mind, in parking lots, in conversations with her mother and her colleagues, in herself in the mirror on bad mornings when the news was heavy and the world felt like it hadn't changed at all. She knew what to do. She knew how to survive this kind of stop. What she didn't do, what she had no reason to do yet, was reach for the badge holder sitting in the center console. Not yet. She was Carrie Russell, and she was going to let this play out exactly the way Dan Porter intended. right up until the moment she didn't. The cruiser door opened, footsteps on gravel, and then the flashlight hit the window like an accusation. Dan rapped his knuckles on the glass. Hard. 3 times. Not a knock. A declaration. The window came down smooth and quiet, and the first thing Dan noticed was the air. Cool, controlled, the soft smell of something expensive. The interior of the Mercedes was immaculate. No clutter, no food wrappers, no evidence of anything except a woman who took care of her things. He hated that immediately. Carrie turned and looked at him. Not up at him, level, steady. Her hands still on the wheel, visible, exactly where they should be. Her expression wasn't fear and it wasn't anger. It was something worse, in Dan's estimation. It was patience. Good evening, officer. Asterisk, she said. Asterisk, is there a problem? Her voice was clear, articulate, the kind of tone that carried its own quiet authority, the voice of someone accustomed to being in rooms where her words carried weight. Dan leaned into the window frame. License and registration. No greeting returned. No explanation offered. Just a command delivered flat, like she hadn't spoken at all. Carrie held his gaze for 1 measured second. Then she moved, slowly, deliberately, announcing every motion before she made it. My registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for it now. I didn't ask for a commentary. Asterisk, Dan said. Asterisk, I asked for the documents. She retrieved them without another word and held them out. Dan took them without looking at them. Do you know why I pulled you over? He asked. I was doing the speed limit. Asterisk, Carrie said. Asterisk, my registration is current. My insurance is current. So no, I don't know why you pulled me over. Dun's jaw tightened. You've got something hanging from your mirror obstructing your view. Carrie glanced at the rear view mirror. Clean glass. Nothing on it. Nothing near it. There's nothing on my mirror, officer. Don't tell me what I see. Asterisk, Dan snapped, his voice dropping an octave. Asterisk, step out of the vehicle. On what grounds? The words came out calm. No temor. No escalation. Just a simple, direct question that any person had every legal right to ask. And it detonated something in Dan Porter. On the grounds that I'm telling you to, he said, his face moving closer to the window. Asterisk. Or are you going to make this difficult? People like you always want to make it difficult. Asterisk. People like you. Carrie looked at him. She let the words sit in the air between them exactly as long as they deserved. Then she unclipped her seatbelt slowly, opened the door, and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder with her hands visible at her sides. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Dan Porter was already writing a report in his head that had nothing to do with what was actually happening on this road. And somewhere in the center console behind her, the badge waited. Dan moved fast once Carrie was out of the car. Too fast. The way men move when they've already decided the outcome and just need the paperwork to catch up. He stepped past her, reached through the open driver's door, and started pulling. Center console first, her phone, a notepad, a charging cable. Glove box next. Insurance documents, a rental agreement, a folded map of Raleigh she hadn't thrown away. He tossed each item onto the seat like he was looking for something he was certain existed. He was certain because he needed it to exist. You can't search this vehicle without consent or probable cause, Carrie said from behind him. Her voice hadn't changed. Still level. Still precise. Asterisk, I have given neither. Smell of marijuana. Asterisk, Dan said without turning around. Probable cause. You're lying. He stopped. He straightened up slowly and turned to face her. In 16 years, very few people had used that word directly to his face. The ones who had were usually in handcuffs within 30 seconds. What did you just say to me? I said you're lying. Asterisk, Carrie repeated. Same volume. Same tone. I don't smoke. This is a rental, and you know exactly what you're doing. Dan took one step toward her. Turn around. Hands on the hood. Carrie placed her hands on the warm metal of the Mercedes hood and stared straight ahead at the dark tree line across the road. She could hear Dan moving behind her, the creak of his belt, the shuffle of his boots on gravel, the aggressive performance of a man who needed an audience even when there wasn't one. He patted her down roughly. Shoulders, sides, pockets. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. Frustrated, he stepped back to the car and reached under the driver's seat. His hand closed around something solid. Cold. Rectangular. He pulled it out. It was a slim leather badge holder. Dan turned it over in his hand. He hadn't expected this. He had expected, hoped for, something that confirmed his narrative. A weapon. A bag. Anything that made the story he was telling himself true. Instead, he was holding something he didn't immediately recognize for what it was. He flipped it open. The gold caught the beam of his own flashlight and threw it back at him. It was heavy in a way that cheap metal never is. The kind of weight that meant something that had been earned rather than manufactured. An eagle spread its wings across the top of the shield, proud and unmistakable. Below it, set in deep blue against the gold, letters that Dan Porter read once, then read again, because the first time didn't make sense to him. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Beneath that, a photo ID behind clear laminate. Sharp. Official. The kind of credentials that didn't come from a novelty website or a costume shop. Carrie Russell. Special Agent. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Civil Rights Division. Dan's flashlight hand dropped slightly. The gravel under his boots suddenly felt less solid than it had 60 seconds ago. He looked up at Carrie. She had turned around. She was facing him now, hands no longer on the hood, standing with the stillness of someone who had been waiting patiently, professionally, without panic, for exactly this moment. She wasn't afraid. She had never been afraid. She had been building a case. "Do you want to call in?" Carrie said quietly. "Or should I?" Dan's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The badge was still in his hand. He looked down at it again, as if the second look might change what it said. As if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. As if the weight of it might somehow get lighter. It didn't. "Officer Porter," Carrie said, and the use of his name, calm, deliberate, precise, landed like a door closing. Asterisk, "I need you to think very carefully about your next move." Dan Porter stood on the shoulder of Route 9 with a federal badge in his shaking hand and 16 years of unchecked certainty collapsing beneath him like wet ground. He had pulled over the wrong woman, and somewhere a recording had captured every single second of it. Carrie made one phone call. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform it for Dan's benefit or narrate it like a threat. She simply stepped 2 feet away from him on the gravel shoulder of Route 9, dialed the number she knew by heart, and spoke in the same, even tone she had used from the moment Dan Porter knocked on her window. "It's Russell. I need the team. Route 9, mile marker 14, Millhaven. I've been stopped, searched without consent, and I have the officer's badge number." A pause. "No, I'm Fina. Just bring everyone." She hung up. Dan was still holding her badge. "I'm going to need that back," she said. He handed it over without a word. His fingers had left smudges on the gold. They came in 12 minutes. Not one car. Not a supervisor with a clipboard and a concerned expression. 3 black SUVs, unmarked, moving fast and quiet up Route 9 with no lights until they were close. And then all at once, the road was flooded. Doors opened before the vehicles fully stopped. 4 agents in tactical vests swept the scene with the fluid, practiced precision of people who had done this in places far more dangerous than a dark county road in North Carolina. Behind them, a woman in a gray suit stepped out of the second vehicle. Special Agent in charge Monica Reeves. Carrie's direct supervisor. A woman who had been in federal law enforcement for 23 years and had the particular expression of someone who had seen this exact situation before and was exhausted by it. She walked straight to Carrie. "You okay?" "Fine," Carrie said. "It's all on the dash recorder. His and mine." Reeves turned and looked at Dan Porter for a long, quiet moment. The kind of look that didn't require words because the words would come later, in rooms Dan hadn't been in yet, in front of people whose names he didn't know. "Secure his weapon," Reeves said to the agent beside her. You can't, Dan started. Officer Porter. Reeves stepped toward him, and the authority in her voice was so complete and so effortless that Dan stopped mid-sentence like a man who had walked into a wall. You conducted an unlawful stop, an unlawful search, and made physical contact with a federal agent without cause. You're not in a position to tell me what I can and cannot do. Stand there and do not speak. Dan stood there. He did not speak. The first domino was his badge. Surrendered on the shoulder of Route 9 at 9:51 p.m., logged into evidence. Photographed next to the tire track his cruiser had left in the gravel when he pulled out from behind the mill without cause. The second domino was the dash footage. Both cameras, Dan's department-issued recorder and the independent device Carrie kept in her own vehicle, had captured everything. The stop, the search, the moment Dan leaned through the window and said, "People like you." The moment he reached under the seat without a warrant. The moment he held a federal badge in his hand and stood in silence while the full weight of what he had done settled over him like a sentence being read. The footage was pulled, copied, and logged before Dan's cruiser had been towed off the shoulder. The third domino was the pattern. Because Carrie Russell hadn't just been driving home from Raleigh that Tuesday night. She had been driving home from a meeting, a federal task force meeting about a cluster of civil rights complaints filed against the Millhaven Police Department over the previous 22 months. 7 complaints. The same officer's name on every single one. Unlawful stops. Excessive searches. Racially motivated targeting. Each complaint reviewed. Each complaint closed. Until now. Now, there was an 8th complaint, filed by a federal agent, supported by his lawyer objected twice. Both objections were overruled. By the third day, he had mostly stopped trying. He talked about the Civil Rights Division and the work it did in places that didn't make headlines. He talked about the courage required to do that work, not in the abstract, but on a dark road at night. Alone, with a flashlight in your face and a man behind it who had decided before he reached your window who you were. He talked about what it means to hold the line. Then he called Carrie's name. She walked to the podium. She shook his hand. She accepted the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service, a medallion on a navy ribbon, heavy and simple, the kind of thing that doesn't need ornamentation because what it represents already has enough weight. The room applauded. Carrie looked out at the faces, her colleagues, her supervisor Monica Reeves in the front row, 2 of the complainants from the trial who had been quietly invited and were sitting in the back looking slightly overwhelmed by the marble and the flags and the formal weight of a room finally taking their side. She thought about Route 9. She thought about her hands on the steering wheel. She thought about the 11 seconds between when Dan Porter saw her face and when he turned on his lights. 11 seconds that a federal forensics analyst had frozen on a courtroom screen and shown to a jury that came back in under 3 hours. She thought about how many people had driven that same road, been stopped by that same man, and had no badge in their center console to change the ending. That's the work, she thought. Asterisk, that's why. 340 miles away, in a federal correctional facility outside of Charlotte, Dan Porter was watching television in the common room. He watched the ceremony the way men watch things they can no longer touch, from behind glass, from a distance that is both physical and permanent. He saw Carrie at the podium. He saw the medallion. He saw the room full of people standing for her. He sat with his hands between his knees and said nothing. There was a man next to him on the bench who glanced at the screen and then back at his magazine without interest. Dan was grateful for that. He didn't want to explain. He didn't have the language for it anymore. The language of justification and instinct and 16 years of certainty. All of that had been cross-examined out of him. What was left was simpler and harder and true. I saw a black woman in a nice car, and I decided she was a problem. She was the most qualified person on that road. And I never gave her 2 seconds to be anything other than what I had already decided she was. Carrie stepped away from the podium and found Monica Reeves waiting at the edge of the stage. "How do you feel?" Reeves asked. Carrie considered the question the way she considered most things, fully, without rushing it. "Like we're not done," she said. Reeves smiled. "We're never done." "Good," Carrie said. She clipped the medallion onto the inside of her blazer, close to her chest, where it didn't show. She didn't need it to show. She picked up her bag and headed for the door. It was a briefing at 4. A new case. A sheriff in Georgia with a pattern that looked familiar. The same road, different town, different name on the badge, same 11 seconds of decision hiding inside every stop report. Carrie Russell walked out of the building and into the bright Washington afternoon. She had work to do, and she had never once needed anyone's permission to do it. No, he didn't get what was coming to him. He got exactly what he ordered. We just delivered it. If this story of justice hitting back harder than anyone expected moved you, hit that like button. Do it for Carrie Russell. Do it for every person who has ever been pulled over for no reason other than the color of their skin and the car they work hard to drive. Now I want to ask you something real. If you were in Carrie's position that night, alone on a dark road, a gun on his belt and a smirk on his face, could you have stayed that calm? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and the answers always surprise me. And if you want more stories where corrupt, arrogant people get exactly what they ordered, subscribe. Because Dan Porter is not the last of his kind, but neither is Carrie Russell. Remember, the badge on your chest only protects you until you meet someone whose badge outranks it and whose patience you just ran out of.